Hi. Actually, really nice to have like a small, intimate audience in these like strange times doing lectures over the internet. Um, I I think I'm going to start mostly by just talking without slides, with uh, my camera on me. And I want to introduce this briefly by saying um, it's a it's a talk that has a strange genesis. It was a an essay originally, which was published by Zero Books. Sorry, not Zero Books. It's called Year Zero, but it's published by Machine Books. So great thanks to Tim Abrahams for commissioning me for that essay. But it then became a lecture, which was going to be at the Soane Museum. So I should thank Owen Hopkins, who was the former senior curator of exhibitions at Sir John Soane's Museum. That was also the first bit of work that I had that got cancelled because of COVID. I was going to do that lecture, I think the day that lockdown got announced. So in a funny way, this lecture is a bit of a time what thinking about the past might be now. Obviously, I also wanted to thank Ellis and Rosie for organising this. I think the Architecture Foundation in this series, firstly, have done something amazingly nimble, and it's really great to see institutions kind of facilitating the discourse in this way. Created a really broad series of talks, some of which I've enjoyed, but they've also made this amazing resource, which I think, you know, in the future will form a very strange snapshot into architectural discourse at a pivotal time. And in a strange way, this is the theme of my talk. I'm talking about 1997, but I'm also trying to make a grasp at what zeitgeist means. And I'm talking about turning points or year zeros, the moment that everything changed. So yeah, as well as what Ellis just pointed out, you should check out some of the other bits of 100 Day Studio online on YouTube. I should also point you to Otto Smith-Smith's 1963 Year Zero and Olivia Horsfall Turner's 1720 Year Zero, two really good texts, which I think make some interesting and bold claims about moments in the past when architecture has changed. So architectural historians, which I should caveat and point out, I am not one, but every now and then I like to have a go. Architectural historians, like many other types of historians, are wary of pointing to year zero or clear turning points, since there's always going to be some sense of continuity alongside even the most dramatic change. However, looking provisionally at a historic turning point is useful as an exercise. It's useful to help us understand how change happens, help us understand why things didn't change, and maybe learn from the gross mistakes of the past. And as I said, what I'm trying to get at here is a really hard thing to grasp, and it's an idea of zeitgeist. And there certainly was one in 1997, and there is obviously one now. So I'm talking about three people, three figureheads, three people who are in many ways bigger than themselves, bigger than normal human beings. I'm talking about Diana, Princess of Wales. I'm talking about Frank Gehry, and I'm talking about Tony Blair. I can't imagine anyone would argue that we are currently going through an historic moment of change. COVID-19 appears to have made a kind of almighty year zero, a year zero that's hard to beat compared with 2008 or 2001. So the question now might be, which I'm aiming somewhere to frame. The question might be, how do we steer from here on? Architecture works with the lag time. There's tricky conceptions, there's protracted gestations, and there's often painful births, meaning that a building may well be an anachronism before it's even built. Some buildings, however, change the weather. They generate eras rather than respond to them. In 1997, the Guggenheim Bilbao ushered an era of the spectacle building. The concept was intermingled, intrinsically tied up with a concept of culture-led regeneration. The world looked on as Bilbao became the gleaming exemplar on the Nervion, but perhaps this bright start was actually a spark for a series of fateful successive events which led us to the tragic place we are now. When Frank Gehry got to Bilbao a month before the Guggenheim opened, he was overwhelmed. And in his trademark coarse voice, he said, "I went over the hill and saw it shining there. I thought, what the fuck have I done to these people?" He designed a building, an extraordinary piece of architecture, but it would be an oversimplification to suggest that the building alone changed things. There's something tragic about the character of Gehry. He was fated and in some ways bound by fate through his own brilliance to begin something that has unraveled before him. In this case, as always, it's important to point out that the agency of the architect is very partial. Architects work in a context. So what has to be in place is fertile ground. That might include a willing populace, politicians and institutions who are in it for the long haul, and a serious integration with a place. Massive regional and sub-regional schemes played a coordinated part in the Bilbao process. Significantly, the first metro was completed in 1995, jointly funded by national, regional and EU government. And the Basque water provider had spent €1 billion in Bilbao in an ongoing project to clean up the river ever since 1984. Juan Ignacio Verdate was the museum's director. His involvement dated to the time of its early 1990s inception. He said that it was meant to be, I quote, a transformational project, a catalyst for a wider plan to turn around the city in industrial decline. It was to be a driver of economic renewal. This is a key concept here. It was to be a driver of economic renewal that would appeal to a universal audience and reinforce local self-esteem, all of which it did. It has been rewarded with a steady 1 million visitors a year. In the 20th anniversary year, it received its 20 millionth visitor. Sean Griffiths, professor of architecture at Westminster University, recently said in his inimitable tone, "The size of this puppy brings home the sheer magnitude of the pile of dog shit fuming behind it. That the latter should become the poster child of neoliberal urban regeneration could not be more appropriate." I suppose I should point out at this point that although the Guggenheim Bilbao is not universally loved, it is universally recognized. No matter how ridiculous or arrogant you think the Guggenheim Bilbao might be as a building, you can't help but recognize its significance. So now I was going to quickly go through some slides. It's such a change. When I was doing my part one, the architectural history professor used to load physical slides into a physical slide machine, and now I can project them at the speed of thought across the internet. So This is, as I'm sure you all know, the gleaming exemplar on the Nervian. This, as I'm sure you all know, is Frank Gehry. This is the massive dog that Sean Griffiths was referring to, behind which he said was a steaming pile of shit, and which I think is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration. It's one of the more remarkable bits of architecture that was built in my life. No doubt it has its flaws, but I think a pile of shit is maybe a bit rough. Anyway, I'm gonna stop share now and move back to lecture mode. So it wasn't a wholly new set of ideas in Bilbao. Sydney had shown the value of a transformative landmark. Places like Glasgow or Pittsburgh had striven to raise themselves through culture or museum buildings. Although these are all places with a long history of cultural prominence, the idea was inserting some new culture might help the economy. We also saw perhaps an example of this earlier in the late 70s with the Beaubourg development, which centered around the Pompidou Centre, an early Rogers design alongside Sue Rogers and Renzo Piano. So we can see some of what later happened in Bilbao there, but obviously Bilbao is not Paris. The Liverpool Garden Festival, 1984, started in 1984, was perhaps a closer precedent, if far smaller, closer at least to the spirit of what happened in Bilbao. And interestingly, it was overseen by Michael Heseltine, a liberal-leaning deputy prime minister under the conservative Thatcher. Bilbao was different in many ways, obviously. Specifically, it had experienced a steep decline in heavy industry. 60,000 manufacturing jobs were lost between 1975 and 1995, almost half of existing industrial jobs. The key question when looking at the ultimate meaning of culture-led regeneration is really whose culture is doing the leading. Rarely the culture of the place or the people who are being regenerated. Was it the culture of those 60,000 workers doing the leading in 1997? I suggest that the culture being promoted in the Guggenheim Bilbao in 1997 had more in common with Islington or the Rive Gauche or Brooklyn than the Baracallo, the working class district in North Bilbao, whose population has been decreasing since the early 1990s and is still on that trajectory. Bilbao has become an easy answer. It's become received wisdom. Perhaps novelty played part in its success, but with every new imitation cultural building in a port industrial town, the newness is diminished. This now decades-long craze might have happened in any case, but the Guggenheim gave it more than fuel, it sparked something. There are two culture-led regeneration models that stem from Bilbao. One, where public authorities in Hull or London or Metz sought to use some version of the Bilbao effect. That phrase was often used in documents when developing waterside ex-industrial spaces, to use the Bilbao effect to kickstart regeneration. Kickstart itself, kind of thinking about what that means, is kind of an agonizing phrase, a strange analogy for developing a place. What these places have in common is a traumatic history of deindustrialization and a political class which is suspicious, bordering on contemptuous of organized labor. In the other type of culture-led regeneration, overwrought shapes as marketing tools for the private sector see skylines of Chinese cities or the pandemonium of London's horizon. What both approaches, public and private, have in common is the use of spectacle to distract attention, perhaps a kind of false consciousness creation. distracting attention away from more fundamental material benefits which we might enjoy from new buildings. So in reality, culture-led regeneration is often a mix between these two types. It's a kind of third way of regeneration. It sits between the market and the state providing some infrastructure and some making good of land, and the market then filling in the gap beyond that. And this approach gives equal opportunity. It gives equal opportunity to be dazzled by spectacle. And what I found interesting when writing this the first time is how it coincided with Diana's last years, in a way that she epitomizes a certain type of celebrity spectacle, and her death in 1997 captured a feeling in the British public which was expressed through public space. In both of the models of culture-led regeneration, there's often a connection to water. Typically, the stretch of water becomes aestheticized in the regeneration, denuded of its old function. Previously working ports or docks are now only gazed upon. What had once been the space of working class labour and mass employment became a leisure space for service industry workers, a spectacle of its former self. In the UK and elsewhere, the bombastic buildings of culture-led regeneration have their analogue in housing. So 1997 was a key year for at least two things in the world of architecture: Bilbao and the start of a certain attitude towards housing. It was in this year that the phenomenon of culture-led regeneration started, and the year that UK housing started on its current course towards today's complex housing crisis. These are two issues, two sides of the same coin that may seem at first unrelated. So why is housing linked into culture-led regeneration? Well, housing is always a corollary of industry or labour. People historically have lived near where they work, at least for the past couple of millennia. But as I said at the beginning, this may well be changing as I speak. Right now I'm delivering a lecture. I think if I open this curtain behind me, can you see this? While looking out over the sea. And for centuries, this would have been impossible. For centuries, I would have had to be in a room with you guys in London. So perhaps this is changing, but at least in 1997, and basically until about 6 months ago, people worked near to where they live. There's obviously various other complex intertwined reasons why the UK has a housing crisis. And I'm not really here to talk about them. I'm not really here to kind of make any claims beyond pointing out that 1997 started where we are now. So the two issues of housing crisis and culture-led regeneration stem from increasingly post-industrial economy. The response in 1997 was to change from the managed decline of the conservative years of the previous 17 years of government. The key political event underpinning these new responses was the historic landslide Labour victory. On the 1st of May 1997, Tony Blair won an historic large majority and became Prime Minister of Great Britain. This is the other reality of contemporary working. My 2-year-old son is crying in the background. So it was also the moment Tony Blair had the pulpit. So it's important to remember that the amount of airtime spent on Tony Blair in those moments was massive. The media was a very different landscape. TV was the biggest medium. Social media wasn't even a glint in some San Franciscan's eye. And it's hard to remember the galvanizing effect of huge parliamentary majorities, with something approximating public consensus, at least incredibly more consensus-based than what we have now. That shift was seismic. And there are a few more dramatic shifts in electoral politics than Blair's election. Perhaps we've seen a couple recently, but essentially Blair's election was the last time the pendulum swung that widely. And that shift, that massive pendulum swing, was paralleled in the built environment. So understanding these two issues, the career of Blair and culture-led regeneration, is important to understand where we are now. As I said, Diana was the other figure who defined this moment, and Tony Blair aligned himself with her. He captured the moment for many people by naming her the People's Princess. So a consequential thread continues from this moment through the world-shattering events of 2001, the Twin Towers, 2008, the Lehman Brothers crash, and up to now. The paradigm has strangely not altered, even though history has shifted massively. Industry heads still promulgate the dogma of culture-led regeneration. Here, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. Thatcher's economics, ascendant throughout the 1980s, right up until 1997, involved replacing heavy industry with the service sector, and the associated result of replacing organised labour with atomised consumers. 1997 was the moment when Labour had to deal with the results of this deindustrialisation. For Blair and for New Labour, the key change was adding culture and creativity into the policy making. Blair wrote, "The world's new knowledge economy pushed you further up the value-added chain all the time." Richard Florida later put things even more sharply. Florida argued that his neologistic category, the creative class, was the norm-setting class for our time. In 1998, the Department of Trade and Industry Minister, Peter Mandelson, published a paper written by Charles Ledbetter titled "Our Competitive Future, Building the Knowledge-Driven Economy." The paper explicitly dismissed labour effort and physical capital as part of the old models in economics. So the idea that making things with your hands or machines is part of an old model of economics. This is something that underpins that moment. It underpins a kind of class snobbery, and it underpins an entrenchment of the service industry in our country, which has its severe effects on architecture, on places, on cities. So the positive examples of economic success for the DTI, for the Department of Trade and Industry under Peter Mandelson, were anything but traditional manufacturing. It's a remarkable thing about the DTI that essentially in 1997 it replaced industrial policy with arts policy, cultural means for economic ends. In contrast to the loud claims made about the promise of culture-led regeneration and its workers in the creative economy and the creative class, very little said about the real growth sectors up until this day, which are essentially the gig economy and the servile class. They did then and they do now represent a much larger part of people's lives. We're thinking about Uber or Deliveroo or call centres. There are more domestic servants in the cultural workers in the UK currently. And they're adding to their numbers faster too. Yet there's no government press releases lauding servile Britain or the scullery economy. James Hartfield wrote this in his paper, The Creativity Gap. Inherent to the idea of year zero is a tragic conception of fate. A tragedy in the sense that somehow the unfolding story has its own inescapable internal logic. Things start with a bind, some wrinkle in space. And from there, the events have their trajectory. Inevitably, they lead to somewhere specific, but somewhere unknown. The bind here the profound bind, is an unemployable class. Understanding this tragedy, with its exposition of the partial nature of agency, helps us to understand the process of city building. So what I mean there is understanding the deep ways that the economy is tied in to people's daily lives, and the way that we build architecture which reflects that, is the only way to unpick the logical inevitability of these trajectories. Understanding when there are year zeros or turning points, in understanding them, we have maybe an opportunity, a chance to redirect the trajectory. I'm not wholly optimistic about that, but I think if ever there was an opportunity, it's now. So back to the main thrust of the lecture. Shakespeare's Globe opened in 1997. Shakespeare never played in Shakespeare's Globe. He did play in The Globe. Adding his name to the building's title only serves to emphasize the strange simulacrum that the building is. It was a harbinger of the new spectacle of cultural regeneration. Shakespeare's Globe was a real oddity in London, but it was by the waterside. It replaced a formerly industrial building. It was a kind of precedent. In 1997, it was also the year that the Dome was conceived. Peter Mandelson was at the helm. Mandelson famously said in one of the initial meetings with Stephen Bailey, the one-time creative director of the Dome, Mandelson said, "I want more wow spots in the Dome." And we still don't 100% know exactly what a wow spot is. The Millennium Dome encapsulates so much of what occurred in the years following 1997. As much as the Dome took from the 1951 Festival of Britain, it was an obvious descendant of Bilbao. However, to blame the Guggenheim Bilbao for the effects of its legacy is unjust. From the political and cultural comments of the currents of the time, not all of them noble, it drew the energy to make a phenomenon that few would wish away, least of all Bilbao itself. The real lesson is that Guggenheim Bilbao can't be copied because it arose out of unique circumstances. So understanding truly the condition, the context that you're building in, that you're hoping to rebuild in, is key to not just remaking the same mistakes. Bilbao was big, but perhaps the more profound, if less obvious change was housing. It was also the year that the Blair government had the idea of commissioning the general review of the built environment led by Richard Rogers, called Towards an Urban Renaissance, published in 1999. The document had a huge impact on people's daily lives. It reappraised the city core, waterfront, and entrenched the concept of culture-led regeneration. It could be argued it had a calamitous effect on the suburbs by restricting growth. Ostensibly, it examined the question of how 4 million projected new homes over 25 years might be accommodated in the UK. This has not happened. Those 4 million projected new homes have not been built. Towards an Urban Renaissance was formed in the same zeitgeist as Guggenheim Bilbao. It's cut from the same material. And in fact, it entrenched some of the misunderstood lessons from Bilbao. Rogers wrote a few years after the publication of Towards an Urban Renaissance, Rogers wrote, "New vitality has been achieved in many city centres through lottery-funded cultural infrastructure. But projects such as the Baltic in Gateshead, Tate Modern in London, the Lowry and the Imperial War Museum in Salford will not benefit deprived communities unless we can also achieve integrated design-led housing renewal." This never happened. All of the regeneration projects Rogers references here trace their conception back to the Guggenheim Bilbao. They're all galleries on former industrial sites on the waterfront. The review that led to the published report was commissioned by New Labour to identify the causes of urban decline and establish a vision for Britain's cities. essentially towards an urban renaissance was the policy of the metropolitan elite, by the metropolitan elite, for the metropolitan elite. The massive failure of the urban renaissance, how it created a shortfall of land available for housing for the sake of slick city centre high-rises, which benefited very few people, it took decades to play out. Meanwhile, we surrendered the suburbs to regressive architects, and we retrenched the extant planning structure, setting off a series of events which should eventually lead to the catastrophic high house prices and high rents in the southeast. As I said, there are several complex reasons for the housing crisis, land banking, mortgage liquidity, the right to buy to rent, which we're not covering here. One of the quieter long-term outcomes of the changes in 1997 was the project Pathfinders. This is a kind of a poor cousin towards an urban renaissance. This was overseen by Prescott, John Prescott, who was Deputy Prime Minister under Tony Blair in 1997. In some senses, it was the housing analogue to culture-led regeneration. The Housing Market Renewal Initiative, to give them their full Orwellian name, were public-private partnerships in a selection of cities and conurbations from Birmingham northwards, which entailed the demolition and, in theory, the replacement of housing in working class areas. Often, only the demolition happened. In part, Pathfinders related to the philosophy of urban compactness and containment that underlines the urban renaissance agenda. The scheme had a potential $5 billion of public money, and it was launched in 2003 to kickstart the renewal of impoverished cities. This admirable ambition was impaired by the method of demolishing Victorian inner city neighbourhoods, preparing them for private architect/developers. Developers demand cleared sites, and the Pathfinder's job was to find and clear them. This technique, known in the 1960s as winkling, was once performed by the likes of Rachman. It was now being performed by the state. Rachman, for those under the age of, 60, was an infamous 1960s slum landlord in London who essentially kind of invented a certain kind of corrupt practice, or at least epitomized it. The Pathfinder scheme was marked by controversy. In a rather extraordinary footnote of history, I'm sure Yvette Cooper herself doesn't particularly remember it, but in 2007, Yvette Cooper was found to be paying for editorial content from The Guardian to promote the scheme, to promote the Pathfinder scheme as kind of fake advertorial. That taxpayers' money is used to further the interests of private developers against local homeowners is bad. That such money should be spent on inducing newspapers to dress public relations as journalism was, as Simon Jenkins wrote, close to sleaze. Pathfinders was a small aspect of what was the start of the Blairite housing boom, culminating in 2007. It was epitomised by pour doors and luxury flats, but the housing boom never solved the housing crisis. And it's hard to imagine any solution to the housing crisis these days, any solution that wouldn't involve seismic social change. The counterexample, of course, would be the post-war public housing programs, but today is different in many ways. Not least, the housing shortage and extortionate prices and rents are so intrinsic to the UK's current form of capitalism. I'm going to drag in Engels at this point. Engels wrote, "It's not the solution of the housing question, It is not that the solution of the housing question simultaneously solves the social question, but that only by the solution of the social question, that is, by the abolition of the capitalist mode of production, is the solution of the housing question made possible." Essentially, you can't change housing. You can't change housing without fundamentally changing social relations. Looking in the rearview mirror, Objects are closer than they appear. Sometimes they are blocked by larger events. 1997 is eclipsed by the millennium, which is eclipsed by 9/11, which was made for a while to feel ever present by the War on Terror, which was then firmly put in the past by the 2008 crash and the Great Recession. And now we have the monolith of COVID, which obscures a lot of this. But all the more important to look back at recent history and consider what's happened in the last 20 years and consider how we might try and do things differently. And that past, the passing of 20 years makes the persistence of culture-led regeneration and the concepts of the urban renaissance all the more remarkable. And so, one wonders why people are still talking about culture-led regeneration. The GLA still put money towards culture-led regeneration. And one solution, maybe a cynical solution to that problem, is that perhaps the persistence of this form of regeneration is born of a deeply held contempt for its antithesis, which would be serious industrial strategy with its concomitant organized labor and a focus on the suburbs, which we might guess has as many aesthetic as socio-political downsides for those in power. On the surface, 1997 looks like the start of an architectural renaissance, or at least the start of a new defense of architecture. This is what Rogers was doing, and this is what Gehry was doing. However, that defense was predicated on architecture's instrumental role, rather than a defense of architecture as an autonomous cultural expression. Arguments were made about the importance of architecture and urban planning that pushed back against the common perception that architecture was a luxury. Although it's now obvious that more architecture was not always the right answer in some places. There was an admirable and concerted attempt to reverse the endless criticism aimed at the previous generation's grand visions, which had been curtailed by the crisis of confidence in the late 1970s. So 1997 was the start of something new, something that only now with 20 years hindsight, we can really see. Something perhaps that's now only now available to us for clear analysis. So what specifically changed in 1997? Well, there were more wow spots. There was the new optimism. Things could only get better. But the galvanizing optimism was alloyed with fear and spin. Fear and spin that, I suggest, are with us more than the optimism today. In the run-up to the 1997 general election, Roy Jenkins compared Tony Blair to an elderly butler carrying a priceless Ming vase across a slippery floor. This was a reference to his anxious holding of the poll lead that he had. But in a sense, that anxiety never left New Labour. And that conservatism, strange conservatism in the housing sector, never really left. Instead of using the once in a lifetime landslide victory as a soapbox to make the case for new political ideas, new architectural ideas, or even for social democracy, New Labour equivocated, forever attempting to appeal to those who had contempt for them. For the built environment, this pose was ultimately tragic, essentially because it was a pose that elevated spectacle and image over content. So it feels very much like now we're at the end of an era of some sorts. And so what can we learn from Diana and Blair and Gehry? Well, I'm not sure, but certainly we should learn that spectacle can get in the way and wow spots are never enough. And what I'd like to do now is quickly go through some of these images that I've collected about the time, because in a sense, a zeitgeist is incredibly hard to grasp. And I'm not sure if a a Zoom lecture is the best mode to communicate it. But if we just flick through some of these images of the moment. So here we have Gehry's grand vision, his gleaming exemplar on the Nervion. Here we have that infamous moment. There were three of us in this marriage. The Martin Bashir interview with Princess Diana. And here we have the absolutely spectacular, unbelievable cultural phenomena that was the response to Diana's death. Eventually there were 5 foot deep flowers all the way from Kensington Palace out into the public realm. Here, Great White Hope, Tony Blair with his kind of puppy dog stare out into the future. Here, Kensington Palace, the mastermind, Peter Mandelson, the houses he was trying to knock down. Well, there's Frederick Engels, and here's Diana. So I suppose this is the point at which I should pass back over to Ellis and ask if there are any questions.
Fantastic, thanks, Eddie. Yeah, we've opened up the chat box. So if you want to ask a question, then just pitch your name in the group chat, and I will come to you. But maybe Eddie, do you want to perhaps stop screen sharing, and then we'll see you size.
Well, is that stopped?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I've completely frozen. Okay, we're back in business. Okay. Fantastic. It's interesting. I remember 1997 very well because it was the year that I first started working. You know, I graduated and was in practice for the first time, and weirdly, I was reminded also that it was in London. It was the first. It was the year in which the Future Southwark projects began, which was, you know, remember these Architecture Foundation initiated public realm projects, which included work by Muff and Eric Parry and East in around Borough, and they were, in a way, I think, a kind of response to the Barcelona Olympics. And the kind of strategy of sort of introducing kind of new public spaces of quite a bespoke nature across Barcelona, and I think that thinking was clearly very of great interest to Ricky Burdett, then in his role at the Architecture Foundation and subsequently at the Mayor's office in London, then working with Richard Rogers, obviously, in what I think started off as the Architecture and Urbanism unit. But I remember very distinctly seeing these things happening in 1997 and thinking that they were the first manifestation of thinking about public space in London that had happened for many years. And one looks at, you know, Patrick Keeler's film of London from 1992, and, you know, central to it is a sort of complaint about the absence of the English, or London particularly, Londoners' failure to be able to imagine a public life. And it's fascinating then for you to, I think, to particularly that last image you showed, to put in the image of the flower, the Diana flowers, because there is a kind of an example of a very dramatic, spectacular public life taking over the city in a way that I think one kind of forgets that context.
Sorry to interrupt. It just reminded me quickly, I once spoke to Richard Wentworth about that phenomena, and he was making a claim that something broke in the British consciousness that day, or over those weeks. It was like hot. It was August, and the whole place smelt. He said it kind of like slightly rotting, but something broke, maybe for the better, was his argument. That there had been this long, slow decline, but there was hope. And it was like we needed that outpouring cathartically to kind of move on. It was from kind of 1950s. He was like, we're ever stuck in kind of end of empire moment. And maybe that, the rotting flowers outside Kensington Palace and everyone sobbing was the last cathartic act of getting rid of that sense of kind of England decaying, and 1997 was new. And I think for people of my generation and younger, I think it's really hard to imagine general optimism, a kind of a consensus that we might just, do something new and it's going to be great. And I'm always interested in when you go to, we're at architecture schools, end of year shows, the amount of kind of dystopian darkness involved there, tied in with obviously a great moment for optimism. People are going to start their careers. They've got to, there's something deeply optimistic about being an architect at all. Proposing something new is essential to what we do in our day-to-day practice. But the lack of a spirit of optimism is notable, and I think it has been for years. I think since I graduated, I don't think much changed in that atmosphere.
We've got some questions, Eddie. I'm going to unmute some people. Gu Avas.
Hello, hi Eddie.
Hello.
So I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about 1997 being ground zero, and there having been ground zeros before that, like you mentioned 1720, and then you talked about us being at a ground zero now.
Yeah.
But what I find quite interesting is that, 1997, looking back, did we realize it was a ground zero? Retrospectively, looking back, was 1720 marked as the kind of year of ground zero? And then do we find ourselves in a unique position now, knowing that we are in this moment at that ground zero, and how that might change things in terms of learning from previous, or just being more mindful of the kind of situation we're in?
Well, it might have been a bit of a throwaway point in the middle of the lecture, but the Blair government in 1997, up until the millennium, maybe up until Iraq, I think was quite conscious of leaning on the post-war consensus era, the 45, the NHS, the Festival of Britain, and that was an aesthetic as well as a policy thing. In fact, maybe I'd argue more of an aesthetic than a policy thing. So yeah, I think they obviously 1945 is a kind of a global year zero, and a real reset for this country. So yeah, I think 1997 in some ways was conscious at the time, but I suppose the more subtle argument is they thought they were doing one thing, but they ended up doing something quite different in terms of the future that they had envisioned. If that answers your question.
Kind of, yeah.
Nick Walker.
Hi Eddie, thanks for a fantastic talk. That was really engaging. And I just need to say a quick hello to Lee there. Hi Lee. I've got a question which is about sort of the relationship between work and the home. And I think it sort of ties into this idea of reset, and every time there's a reset, we have a sort of utopian hope of the way society is going to develop, but usually it ends up in more exploitation and people become further compromised. And one thing the COVID-19 pandemic has shown is it's highlighted the socioeconomic inequalities in our society, particularly amongst those who live in overcrowded conditions, or who have to go out to work because their work is manual, or demands that they get on their bike and deliver Deliveroos. At the moment, I'm working from home, and I'm really fortunate in that I've got a nice setup. But as the Canadian government said, we're not working from home, we're at home trying to work during a global pandemic, which is much more truthful. And really, I suppose the idea of home working has been sold to us as this fantastic development, something we should have done 20 years ago. But the reason my experience is so good is because I've got a home study, I don't have any children, and I've got fantastic Wi-Fi. So I think my question is about inequalities. And, you know, for those of you or us who are working at home on our laptops in front of the TV with a child screaming in the background with a really bad Wi-Fi signal, are we being pushed into a new normal of working from home? And is there a danger that companies will look to reduce their overheads and make our homes, pushing a bit, the workhouses of the future?
Yeah. I mean, undoubtedly, I'm not a massive employer, but you know, I've considered my relationship to the workspace, and I think over the next couple of years, there's going to be a hell of a lot of architectural research, you know, going on in, you know, your average part 2 unit will be looking at how we need to readjust, but that readjustment happens from having a special room to do your Zoom call to having more space on the pavement to keep social distancing. I think, you know, everything's changed, but I think it needs work. And, you know, I think architects are quite well placed to do a lot of that hard, rigorous work to work out how we might readjust for the better. I think also, if you take an historical view, a longer view, working at your home was the norm. If you were a weaver or a farmer or any pre-industrial job. And actually it was the advent of the factory which invented the physical distance between these two conceptual places, the workplace and the home place. And returning to that doesn't necessarily seem, you know, like a bad thing, but it's about how it happens and about how much space you have. You know, never has there been more imperative to have space standards in our housing, and that means that where I live in East London, the amount of people who are trapped in substandard housing without any exterior space, and then they also have to work from there, you know, and it's not necessarily privileged white collar workers who have to work from home. There are primary school teachers still have to provide online stuff. So not having enough space in your home just to provide the Zoom call is like a serious issue. But yeah, in kind of overall answer to your question, I think reappraising the conceptual distance between work life and home life has kind of been on the table for a while, and it's only been accelerated, made more urgent by our situation. And yeah, I think learning from the deindustrialization policy and the arts policy of 1997, we could see how to do things differently. And it's definitely to do with policy. You know, this is an economic problem, but it has a sound political underpinning. These are choices that people make, that governments make.
I suppose one of the interesting things about that is the way developers are pushing us into open plan living. Within social housing, you tend to keep the kitchen and the living room separate, at least in Scotland. And what we're discovering from COVID is that actually having room sales within a house is much more useful because you can have that private space, which you can't.
Well, maybe we're going to see a massive flood of new stud walls going up. Well, yeah, maybe a good thing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You know, certainly I've been talking this week to architects who've been beginning to introduce more people back to their offices. The problem's been, how do you operate when you have 5 people on Zoom calls in an open plan office? So it's I think there's going to be some really fundamental architectural changes. I mean, I guess a companion question to that, Eddie, is what kind do you envisage as a new public space, new forms of public space emerging out of this present crisis? I mean, in a way, with what you were talking about, I think in 1997, these spectacular, iconic cultural projects. Of course, they're one of the things that they, beyond producing images, they do produce a very particular kind of public space, which was new to the city. And how do you see that story playing out today?
I mean, this is such a dull answer to the question, but I think a lot of what happened in 1997, tied up with Heritage Lottery or various lottery funds, was a demand for capital-intensive, large capital projects. So, these iconic spaces next to an iconic building. And I think if you've ever worked in public realm design, which I have done for years, the question is always like, how do these spaces get maintained? Because you've got the budget to make the cool-looking thing, but in 5 years' time, it's going to look awful, and there's no more money. So a kind of a culture shift, I think, may occur in understanding more intimate relationships to public spaces, because more people have spent more time going to the park, and so maybe a kind of cultural shift away from the big capital projects towards smaller, incremental. It's what Tom Emerson calls, the gardening approach to architecture. Bits over time, accretions. Although that sounds very kind of righteous and high-minded, and maybe that's not going to happen. And I think one of the things I tried to do in the essay was not completely shit on Gehry. I think it's a remarkable building, and that whether it's your architecture or not, and it's not particularly mine, I think that has to be recognized, that it's not always a bad idea to make a really significant piece of architecture.